Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today at the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism, Building Solidarities. My name is Wincy Lee, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm the Senior Manager of Career Education at X University's Career and Co-op Center, and I'm a member of the steering committee for this forum. Before we jump into closing, I just want to acknowledge that I am joining today's forum from the city of Toronto, which is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. As someone who is originally from Hong Kong, who lived in Norway for a few years before finally settling in Canada, I'm keenly aware that I'm a guest on this land, an uninvited guest at that. So what is my responsibility as I try to establish a community with others, particularly those from other racialized groups? That's a question that has been on my mind a lot, since the planning of this particular forum. As I shared in the concurrent session number 5, where I was just before the closing, my family has always taught me to take off my shoes when I'm visiting someone else's home and don't jump in too quickly to help without taking the guidance from our hosts. Otherwise, you'll end up messing things up. For me, as an Asian person, I believe that building solidarities with our Indigenous, Black, and other racialized folks in our community is much like that in some ways. We need to begin by listening to one another and try to do so without preconceived notions. So our relationship with one another is genuine and founded on respect, and we can move forward in our actions together based on mutual understanding. I know that everyone is probably tired after such a full day, but we wanted to take a few moments to reflect on what we've learned together before we break until tomorrow morning. So please stick with us for another 30 minutes or so. It has been truly wonderful to be a part of today's conversations, covering such a wide range of topics and hearing from so many members of the Asian community and others as well. I know it can be a lot to absorb, and I know that we all need some time to take in what we've learned, to process it. And to give you a jump start on that process and capture some of the insights, some of the lessons and actions that really stood out from today's discussions, we have invited a few community members to share their key takeaways, their lessons learned with us. We will also have some members of our organizing committees reflect on their day as a whole shortly, but we'll start with a quick report back on the concurrent sessions first, since we know that you probably weren't able to split yourself and attend them all at the same time. We're going to do these in a rapid fire format, so I'm going to ask each speaker to introduce themselves, identify the concurrent session that they're speaking to, and then share their key takeaways with us from that session. Let's start with concurrent session number 1. Yumi, over to you.
Hi, so I was in concurrent session 1, which was on Asian studies and Asian Canadian studies, challenges and opportunities. One of the key questions I think that came up and resonated with everyone was around how do we deconstruct, resist, or maybe redefine the boundaries that are implied by categories such as Asian or Asian Canadian studies? And as an extension of this, how do we queer the categories that we're using? Because these areas of studies aren't just about race or language or region, but also about gender, sexuality, and class too. So the lived experience of this intersectionality that we all embody complicate these categories and how people are seeing themselves, and as an extension, kind of how they are seeing their interests in terms of research and study. So there was a little bit of tension too around, are people even identifying as an Asian Canadian scholar when so much of their work feels rooted in other areas as well, such as post-colonialism or critical Black studies? So this speaks to the interdisciplinary nature of Asian and Asian Canadian studies, And in interdisciplinary programs, it's a constant balance and negotiation at the institutional level to ensure that students have access to classes and courses. They aren't restricted by prerequisites, that faculty are able to teach and aren't restricted by, department requirements or having to be cross-appointed and not being able to do that. So there are a number of challenges that happen within interdisciplinary programs such as Asian Canadian Studies, but ultimately the panelists really spoke to the opportunity that interdisciplinary programs offer and the importance of being able to lean into the kind of chaos but also the flexibility that can come with Asian or Asian Canadian studies. And one of the immediate questions was around, how do we foster a culture of connection and solidarity for the work that's going on and that has been going on, whether or not it's recognized or supported by the institution? And how can we take time to acknowledge and celebrate the changes that have happened and the evolution that has happened with respect to the Asian experience in post-secondary? And then also, again, as I said, leaning into the defining aspect of the interdisciplinary nature of Asian or Asian Canadian studies, and really thinking about, rather than being a default that students can't find other options that fit their particular area of interest, how can Asian Canadian studies be sought after because of the dynamic, thriving, and intersectional learning that it offers?
Thank you so much, Yumi. We'll go to Joanne next to report back on concurrent session number 2. Joanne?
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Joanne Tsang, and I'm Legal Counsel and Director of Development Administration at Ryerson University, reporting back on the panel on legal education and anti-Asian racism in the legal system. We were fortunate to have some very accomplished lawyers and academics from the public and private spheres share valuable insights on the connections between anti-Asian racism and the law. In the first of 2 topics, advocating for marginalized, racialized groups, the panelists talked about building a law practice that's focused on serving marginalized communities, and that it requires translating the law into the lived experiences of those that they're serving and vice versa. They also highlighted a 2019 Supreme Court of Canada case, which is a landmark case in the context of anti-Asian racism, because the court explicitly acknowledges that social context, including a person's experiences with racism, should be considered when assessing the nature of police interaction with people from racialized and marginalized communities. And as well, they discussed institutional barriers that are faced by low-income racialized clients of legal clinics, including language barriers, economic barriers, complex rules with limited public legal education to help make sense of it all, and significant power imbalances. These barriers are often hard to overcome unless clients happen to find assistance or have technological capabilities or strong English language skills. So the key takeaway from this first topic is that for the justice system to change, all participants have to work to rebuild it. And in the words of one of the speakers, it's a collective effort. Systemic racism in the legal system is broad and multifaceted. And so if we want to start building solutions, we have to give particular attention and advocate for these marginalized, racialized groups who are disproportionately affected by racism, systemic racism. And the second topic, anti-Asian racism resources in legal education, the panelists communicated that teaching and learning about anti-Asian racism and the unique ways in which it manifests is an important step in building solidarities. This is because all forms of discrimination are relevant to the broader project of advancing racial justice, combating white supremacy, and dismantling oppressive systems, including as perpetuated through the law. They aim to develop a set of user-friendly resources for educators across a range of contexts to use in teaching about anti-Asian racism. These resources will be publicly posted online and will be intended to help educators communicate the long history and continuing relevance of anti-Asian racism in Canada. So from the law panel as a whole, I think the main takeaway is we all have a part to play in continuing to build a more equitable society and combating anti-Asian racism, and we can start now. Those who are interested in the justice system's response to the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes can learn more at an upcoming national webinar on November 16th, hosted by the International Center for Criminal Law Reform and Criminal Justice Policy. And this is merely one example of this important conversation continuing beyond this forum. It's our hope that all these stakeholders, including you, the audience, will take action, even if it's a small step, be heartened by the deepening legal commitment to address anti-Asian racism, encourage ongoing dialogue, and push for policy changes to address anti-Asian racism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Next up, we have Janet reporting back on concurrent session number 3. Janet, over to you.
Thank you so much. So concurrent session number 3 dealt with faculty representation, university recruitment, retention, and promotion. So this was a really fascinating panel discussion. They touched on many of the challenges regarding the policies, procedures, and practices that have hindered, blocked the attraction of many BIPOC candidates and retaining, promoting faculty. So what were some of these obstacles? Well, first of all, the lack of data. We don't know, so we can't say anything. And what data is there is based on self-identification, which is voluntary, so it's not very accurate. Another one was the culture of a university, the norms of a workplace. Diverse people just don't fit. Have you heard that very ugly word, fit? Okay, so diverse people don't belong. A third one, the lack of leadership support in teaching, in research, in service. So what can we do about ramping up the support for diverse faculty? The lack of Asian studies program, the lack of Asian language programs to attract diverse faculty. What about diversing the whole idea that a university has to be economically viable? And if we diversify the university, what does that have to do with the economics of a university? Well, there was a really good answer to that, which I will come to. And then the idea that that somehow we need to deal with all these obstacles. So how do we deal with these obstacles? So what are the carrots? What can we put in place? So how do we retain, attract, promote diverse faculty? Well, one is positive mentorship. We need to have a multi-pronged, holistic approach to enable success in all the areas. Because sometimes, a faculty member may feel very isolated, but with a support system in place, that can really help that person stay. So what about as well that we need to change the way we define excellence and the so-called breadth of research. What? You're doing the study on the same community again? So again, we need to take another look at how we define what we consider excellent research. And then finally, we need to take a multi-pronged, holistic approach to enable success for our BIPOC faculty members. So we're doing this in the Faculty of Arts in our university by revamping some of our internal grants to appeal to research in Indigenous issues or community studies or racial issues. So I think that that pretty well summarizes this session. Thank you so much. And now I'll pass it on back to Wincy.
Thank you so much, Janet. Next up, we've got Dan, who is going to report back on concurrent session number 4.
Hi everyone, my name is Dan Cantiller. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a staff member at the Ted Rogers School of Management and one of the co-chairs for the Positive Space Faculty and Staff Network. So I'm sharing immense gratitude to the panelists for concurrent session number 4, which was the intersectionality of gender, sexual orientation, and Asian identities. As someone who identifies as both Filipino and a member of the 2S LGBTQ+ community, this session felt like a really warm hug, and it was very uplifting and heartwarming. Among the many insights from the panel was the acknowledgement of cultural and language differences in recognizing and discussing gender and sexuality. Panelists also expressed the experience of having to come out multiple times regarding their sexuality as well as their cultural identity or identities. And I think a nugget from the discussion that I wanted to share back with folks here is that from one of the panelists, Christine Su, who said, "Home is where your most authentic self feels seen as whole." And I encourage you, when the recordings are available, to watch the session and hear of the many wonderful perspectives and thought-provoking discussions that were held in this concurrent session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. And last but not least, we've got Maurice.
Thanks, Wincy. Hi, everyone. My name is Maurice Fernandes, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm a career education specialist at X University, and I'm reporting back on the lived experience, concurrent session 5, lived experiences and opportunities for Asian Canadian staff. Our panelists shared personal experiences to gain insight on the model minority myth and its impact on professional development and leadership opportunities. Unfortunately, we did have some technical difficulties with the streaming, but please rest assured that we will be providing a recording very soon. But prior to the difficulties we experienced on the platform, I did pull away a couple of takeaways from the session. The what if questions from Zhu were really enlightening. So, for example, what if we moved beyond reactionary work to actively center and include BIPOC voices? And what if we paid our BIPOC students and staff for the work versus taxing them? When our panelists discussed safety, Annabelle's insight really resonated with me, and she talked about the need to establish safety before we can establish inclusion. And then finally, when it came to representation, right, Hillary touched upon losing bits of our identity to fit in, right, into the Western norms, and the realization that universities are very white spaces. And then, of course, Zhu also shared her insight on the hypervisibility of Asian staff in junior roles. Really speaks volumes to what is important to a university. Thanks, Wincy.
Thank you so much, Maurice. And thank you so much to all of our report back speakers for those great recaps. Clearly, there was a lot of stuff packed into our concurrent sessions, and I really wish that I could have attended all of them, as I'm sure some of you are feeling the same as well. The good news is that the recordings of all the forum concurrent sessions will be shared in the coming days, so we can all go back and review each of the sessions in our own time. And once again, apologies to folks who are experiencing some technical difficulties. We hope that you will take your opportunities and take your time to review some of those recordings later on. Now that we're all caught up on some of the key takeaways from the concurrent sessions, let's take a step back and consider what lessons we can draw from today's dialogue at a more holistic level. For me, what really stood out is the importance of continuing to build your own learning community and making sure that you're intentionally including diverse voices in that circle. So much of our learning and so much of our growth comes from personal relationships, even just the act of gathering today, and as well in the lead up to this national forum. I know I have really enjoyed getting to know some of the panelists and organizers on a more personal level, hearing their stories, learning from their experiences and wisdom, and transforming some of that learning into actions together. I encourage you all to join me in really critically examining who we all have in our own learning communities and striving to broaden that community over time as well. Now I'd like to introduce a few special guests from our organizing committees to join me in sharing their own reflections on the day. We have Lynn Deutscher Kobayashi, who is the Vice President of National Association of Japanese Canadians and member of our steering committee. We have Ameerah Andaya, a student in a social work program at the University of Manitoba and member of our student advisory committee. Finally, we have John Shiga, who is an associate professor in the School of Professional Communication at X University. I want to pass the mic over to you now, Lynn. Please share your learning with us.
Thank you very much, Wincy. I'm pleased and honored to be part of this virtual gathering. And with hope in our hearts as treaty people, we desire to bring good relationship to the places we've settled. And my pronouns are she, her. I'm a third generation Japanese Canadian whose ancestors arrived as settlers in the 1800s. And they experienced government policies of forced displacement, forced labor, dispossession, community and family separation, which caused my father to drop out of school in grade 8. Now, these words of Phil Fontaine, former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, inspire action, which I think is what we want to come out of, some actions out of this forum. He said, "The attempt to transform us failed. The true legacy of the survivor then will be the transformation of Canada. So yes, our work today, tomorrow, and thereafter is to be part of this transformation." Now, earlier today, Hayden King talked about going backwards and forward in time. And I like that, being a little bit older than most of the participants. I can go back a little way. Anyway, I'm going to go back to 1947, because at 84 Gerrard Street East, the NAJC, which was then known as the NJCCA, was founded to fight for justice for Japanese Canadians. And then fast forward to 2019, when Justice Marika Amatsu, the first female Canadian judge of East Asian descent, received an honorary Doctor of Laws from this university. Well, she addressed the class of 2019 and said, "You give me hope for the survival of the species. You will need to redress the scourges of inequality, poverty, discrimination, and homelessness. There's work to do. You will not stand alone. You will find allies amongst us." Well, Justice Amatsu's confidence speaks to her experience as legal counsel for the NAJC, which negotiated the historic federal Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement in 1988. It was then the largest human rights settlement of that time. So on the topic of solidarities, the Redress campaign assembled a national coalition of over 900 individuals and over 60 institutions and ethnocultural organizations. Yes, solidarity. Yet we struggle to ensure that our history is remembered. So one of the insights for me today was when Rabia Lombard made a connection between the indifference to university-level history courses outside of European history and the inadequacies, and she connected that to the inadequacies of the K-12 curriculum in teaching the histories of racialized peoples and developing an interest in those histories early on. So you can see that developing that interest early on would strengthen the demand in universities. Yesterday, I met with a mother whose daughter was in distress because she was told by her high school teacher that what happened to Japanese Canadians was not really that bad. Fellow students had commented that at least her grandfather got fed and paid when he was in the forced labor camp. It's not like he was a slave. So obviously the role of education in mitigating the harm caused by the erasure of communities' histories is clear. And community-led initiatives are essential to ensure the true history of Canada with its underpinning of racism is told. The benefits to the community must outweigh the benefits to the researchers. To conclude, I note that there's a session tomorrow titled the ethics of representing Asian communities in research. I personally will be checking in on that one. So I hope you'll all be back tomorrow. And I thank everyone, to the organizers, and thank you all for attending, and hope you have a great evening. Oh, my apologies, Ameerah, over to you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Lynn. Hi everyone, my name is Ameerah. I'm an undergrad student from University of Manitoba. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm also a member of the Student Advisory Committee. I think that today we have learned a lot about dismantling hierarchies of oppression within universities. I was at the session of intersectionality and gender, sexual orientation, and Asian identities, and I really enjoyed it. And for me, I was very happy to see queer representation, and it meant a lot for me as a student. And I think that as a student, we need to continue to demand that harmful policies and ideologies are dismantled, and we need to continue to question the institutions that we are in and ask who is making these decisions and who does it benefit. I think that this forum is a great way to have these conversations that many of us aren't able to talk about in a classroom setting. And I think that going forward, we also need to continue to build solidarity among communities. And I found that these conversations we had today were very interesting, and I'm excited to see what tomorrow will bring. I'll pass it on to John.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm John Shiga. I'm an associate professor in the School of Professional Communication and the Creative School at X University. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a member of the Academic Advisory Committee for this forum. So what did we learn? Well, one of the things that I learned from today's session is that before we can advance institutional change, we have to better understand the status quo and how it is maintained. Without the underlying systems, or without the systems that are underlying racism within universities, without understanding those, we're at risk of coming up with solutions that deal only with the most obvious symptoms. Banish Ahmed noted that one step in the right direction would be understanding the overlapping forms of institutional and societal oppression, from surveillance to policing to the being exoticized as an Oriental, quote unquote. Hayden King noted that one of the central means of reinforcing the status quo are cycles of resistance, incorporation, and adaptation. And we also know that the issue of anti-Asian racism will likely go through cycles of exposure and visibility as it goes through the news cycles of the media. Learning how to maintain momentum through those cycles will be key to our initiatives going forward. In terms of any initial calls for recommendations, one that jumped out at me was the need to rethink the space of the university, both in terms of its relationship to the indigenous land that it's on, how classroom spaces have been traditionally configured to reinforce hierarchies, and also to rethink where learning takes place, and that might not always be within the university walls. In terms of questions that we still have unanswered, I think we have the now famous lipstick metaphor from Melanie Knight. How do we ensure that our anti-racism initiatives are more than just bureaucratic exercises? And how do we ensure that change happens not only in symbolic and representational levels, but also on the level of institutional practices and resource allocation? Some solutions, immediate and long-term, I'll just, for the sake of time, focus on one long-term solution, which has to do with the incredible challenge of change from within, which is, as many speakers noted, exhausting and frustrating. One means of doing this effectively, I think, is through coalitions within and beyond the university, exploring, for example, as Hayden noted at the beginning of the day, the parallels and connections between the experiences of Asian settlers and Indigenous peoples. As Hayden put it, quote, "There is a historical precedence and untold story of intersections between Asian settlers in Canada and First Nations, going back to a time when both communities were and still are in persistent ways marginalized," end quote. I find that to be a hopeful but also historically rooted possibility for moving forward. And I'll turn it over to you, Wincy.
Thank you so much, Lynn, Ameerah, and John, for sharing your insights and your valuable perspectives with us. It is really wonderful to see such rich interpretations of the many discussions that we were all part of today. There's certainly a lot of enthusiasm. I'm feeling it for continuing this conversation, and this is only just the beginning. And we know that building solidarities will require a lot of time, effort, and commitment. And I hope that you are all as inspired as I am to get to work. As Lynn said earlier, we hope that you will join us again tomorrow for day 2 of the programming. You can find the schedule for day 2 on our website. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening.